Welcome to Night Crime Stories. Tonight, we examine the case of the Jonestown Massacre, where charismatic cult leader Jim Jones led over 900 followers into the jungles of Guyana, promising paradise but delivering death. What began as a utopian dream became America's largest murder-suicide. Settle in, turn off the lights, and let the case unfold. Night Crime Stories. Target runtime, 90 to 120 minutes. The internet connects us in ways our ancestors could never have imagined. We share our thoughts, our interests, our deepest fascinations with strangers across the globe. In digital spaces, we find communities that understand our passions, sometimes passions that others might find disturbing. Tonight, we explore a case that began in the most innocent way possible. A simple recommendation thread on a true crime forum. Users sharing their favorite podcasts, books, documentaries about murder and mystery. Just enthusiasts discussing their shared interest in the darker aspects of human nature. But among those recommendations, something sinister was brewing. One user's posts would catch the attention of investigators months later, when they discovered that this person's fascination with true crime had evolved beyond mere consumption. The line between observer and participant had been crossed in the most terrible way. As we settle in tonight, consider how the digital trails we leave behind tell stories we never intended to write. How our online personas can reveal more than we realize. And how sometimes, the most dangerous predators hide in plain sight among those who share our interests. The true crime subreddit had always been a gathering place for those drawn to humanity's darkest stories. On any given day, hundreds of thousands of users would scroll through posts about cold cases, recent investigations, and theories about unsolved mysteries. It was a community built on a shared fascination with the criminal mind, the detective's pursuit, and the victim's stories that deserved to be remembered. The monthly media recommendation thread was a staple of the community. Posted automatically by the forum's moderator bot, it invited users to share what they'd been consuming in the true crime space. Podcasts that had captured their attention. Books that had kept them awake at night. Documentaries that had changed their perspective on famous cases. It was meant to be helpful, a way for community members to discover new content and for creators to share their work. Detective Sarah Chen of the Portland Police Bureau's Cyber Crimes Unit would later describe scrolling through that particular November thread as one of the most chilling experiences of her career. At first glance, it looked like any other month's collection of recommendations. Users enthusiastically sharing their latest obsessions, debating the merits of different podcasts, warning others away from sensationalized content that didn't respect the victims. But Chen wasn't browsing for entertainment. She was following a digital trail that had led her to this forum, searching for patterns in the posting history of a username that had become central to her investigation. The user went by Nightwatcher_503, the number's likely a reference to the Portland area code, which immediately caught her attention. Nightwatcher_503 had been active in the community for over 2 years. Their post history showed a deep knowledge of true crime cases, particularly those involving young women who had disappeared without a trace. They frequently commented on cases where the bodies were never found, where the perpetrator had seemingly vanished into thin air. Their analysis of these cases was sophisticated, showing an understanding of investigative techniques that went beyond what a casual consumer of true crime content would typically possess. In the November recommendation thread, Nightwatcher_503 had posted a comment that would later send chills down Detective Chen's spine. The comment recommended a lesser-known podcast about disposal methods used by serial killers, praising its technical accuracy and practical insights. They had written, "Most creators don't understand the real challenges of concealment. This one gets it right. Essential listening for anyone serious about understanding the craft." The word craft stood out to Chen. It suggested an appreciation that went beyond academic interest. It implied respect for the skill involved in avoiding detection. As she scrolled through more of Nightwatcher_503's recommendations, a pattern emerged that made her blood run cold. Every single recommendation focused on the perpetrator's methods. The psychology of killers. The techniques used to avoid capture. Never once did Nightwatcher_503 recommend content that centered on victim stories or the families left behind. Never did they suggest material that examined the healing process or the impact of crime on communities. Their interests were clinical, methodical, and entirely focused on the mechanics of murder. But what truly alarmed Detective Chen was what she found when she cross-referenced the posting times of Nightwatcher_503's most active periods with her case files. The user's activity would spike during the same weeks that young women had gone missing in the Portland metropolitan area. Not just any missing persons cases, specifically cases where the women had vanished without a trace, leaving behind no usable evidence for investigators to follow. 3 women had disappeared over the past 18 months. All in their early 20s. All students at local colleges. All last seen in downtown Portland during evening hours. The cases had initially been handled separately by different detectives, as there was no obvious connection between the victims. They moved in different social circles, attended different schools, lived in different neighborhoods. It was only when Detective Chen was assigned to review all open missing persons cases involving women aged 18 to 25 that she began to see the pattern. Not just in the disappearances themselves, but in the digital footprint left by someone who seemed to be documenting their own methodology through their online interactions. The first victim was Jennifer Morrison, a 21-year-old psychology student at Portland State University. She had disappeared on a Thursday evening in March, after leaving her part-time job at a downtown bookstore. Security cameras captured her walking toward the transit station, but she never boarded a train home. Her car was found in the employee parking lot behind the bookstore, keys still in her purse, which was locked inside. The second victim was Maria Santos, a 23-year-old art student at the Pacific Northwest College of Art. She vanished on a Saturday afternoon in July, after telling friends she was meeting someone about a commissioned piece. Her phone was found 2 days later in a storm drain 6 blocks from where she was last seen. The device had been completely wiped clean, with no recoverable data. Detective Chen noticed that in the weeks following each disappearance, Nightwatcher_503's posting activity would increase dramatically. They would engage in long discussions about evidence disposal, about the challenges of conducting thorough searches in urban environments, about the statistical likelihood of solving cases where no body is recovered. Their knowledge seemed to grow more specific with each missing person case. But it was in their recommendation thread posts that Nightwatcher_503 revealed the most about their evolving expertise. After Jennifer Morrison's disappearance, they recommended a documentary about the Green River Killer, specifically praising Gary Ridgway's site selection methods. After Maria Santos vanished, they suggested a podcast episode about digital evidence and how killers could avoid leaving electronic traces. Following Ashley Chen's disappearance, they recommended an obscure true crime book about body disposal in the Pacific Northwest, noting that the author clearly understood the regional geography. Each recommendation served as both a learning resource for other true crime enthusiasts and, Detective Chen began to suspect, a form of documentation for someone who was applying these techniques in real life. The forum had become an unwitting repository of research materials for a killer who was hiding in plain sight among people who shared their fascination with murder. Detective Chen's investigation into Nightwatcher_503's online activity required painstaking digital archaeology. Working with the department's cybercrime specialists, she began mapping not just what the user posted, but when they posted it, how they interacted with other users, and what patterns might emerge from their digital behavior. The challenge was that Reddit, like many social media platforms, only retained certain types of user data for limited periods. However, the public nature of the forum meant that most posts remained visible, creating a digital timeline of Nightwatcher_503's interests and expertise that stretched back over 2 years. What Chen discovered was a masterclass in how someone could use social media to research and refine their criminal methodology while appearing to be nothing more than an enthusiastic true crime fan. The earliest posts from Nightwatcher_503 showed a general interest in true crime, but lacked the specific focus that would later characterize their contributions to the community. They asked broad questions about famous cases, shared mainstream podcast recommendations, and participated in discussions about well-known serial killers like Ted Bundy and Jeffrey Dahmer. Their knowledge seemed consistent with someone who had consumed popular true crime content but hadn't yet developed expertise in any particular area. But around 14 months before Jennifer Morrison's disappearance, Nightwatcher_503's posts began to show a more specialized focus. They started asking detailed questions about investigative procedures, particularly about how police conducted searches for missing persons and what factors made cases more difficult to solve. They showed increasing interest in cases that remained unsolved, analyzing what had gone wrong with the investigations and what the perpetrators had done right to avoid detection. Chen noticed that Nightwatcher_503 had a particular fascination with the concept of the perfect crime. They would often comment on cases where killers had successfully evaded capture for years or decades, praising the intelligence and planning that such crimes required. But their analysis went beyond admiration. They seemed to be studying these cases as if they were textbooks, identifying best practices and common mistakes. One post that particularly caught Detective Chen's attention was a lengthy comment Nightwatcher_503 had made about victim selection. In response to a discussion about serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer's methods, they had written, Dahmer's mistake was choosing victims from his immediate social sphere. The smart approach is to select targets who fit a pattern that investigators won't recognize until it's too late, but who don't have personal connections that lead back to you. The comment had been made 6 months before Jennifer Morrison disappeared. At the time, it probably seemed like an academic observation about criminal psychology. But read in the context of 3 missing women who fit a clear pattern but had no connections to each other or to any obvious suspect, the comment took on a more sinister meaning. Chen's team also analyzed Nightwatcher_503's interaction patterns with other users. While they were active in discussions and seemed knowledgeable about true crime, they rarely shared personal information about themselves. Other users would mention where they lived, what they did for work, details about their families or relationships. Nightwatcher_503 remained carefully anonymous, never revealing anything that might identify them in real life. This level of operational security was unusual for a casual forum user, but it made perfect sense for someone who was using the community for purposes beyond entertainment and education. They were learning from the experiences of both successful and unsuccessful criminals, while ensuring that their own identity remained completely protected. The geographical analysis proved even more revealing. Chen plotted the locations where each victim was last seen against a map of Portland, looking for patterns that might reveal how the killer had chosen their hunting grounds. Jennifer Morrison had disappeared from downtown Portland, near the transit hub where multiple bus and train lines intersected. Maria Santos had vanished from the Pearl District, an area known for its art galleries and young professional population. Ashley Chen had last been seen in the South Waterfront, leaving the OHSU campus. At first glance, the locations seemed random, different neighborhoods with different demographics and different types of activity. But when Chen overlaid the locations with Portland's public transportation system, a pattern emerged. All 3 locations were near major transit stops, places where someone could quickly disappear into the flow of commuters and travelers. More importantly, they were all locations where someone could observe potential victims over time, learning their routines and habits before making a move. This observation led Chen to examine Nightwatcher_503's posting schedule more carefully. She discovered that their most active posting times coincided with Portland's evening rush hour, the same time period when all 3 women had disappeared. It appeared that Nightwatcher_503 would spend their commute time researching and discussing true crime cases online, possibly while simultaneously scouting for victims in real life. The psychological profile that emerged from this analysis was deeply disturbing. Nightwatcher_503 appeared to be someone who had transformed their interest in true crime into a systematic study of criminal methodology. They used the community not just for entertainment, but as a research tool to improve their own criminal skills. They had weaponized the collective knowledge of thousands of true crime enthusiasts, turning their shared fascination with murder into a resource for planning actual murders. But perhaps most chilling was the realization that Nightwatcher_503 wasn't just learning from the community, they were contributing to it. Their posts about evidence disposal, victim selection, and investigative blind spots weren't just theoretical discussions. They were sharing practical knowledge gained through experience, teaching other users techniques that they had presumably tested in real life. The forum had become a place where a killer could hide in plain sight, sharing their expertise while pretending to be nothing more than another true crime fan. Every recommendation they made, every insight they shared, every technique they praised was potentially based on first-hand knowledge of what worked and what didn't in the real world of criminal activity. Chen realized that she wasn't just investigating 3 missing persons cases, she was uncovering a new form of criminal behavior, where social media and online communities had become both research tools and documentation methods for active killers. The traditional boundaries between online and offline activity had dissolved, creating new challenges for law enforcement and new opportunities for criminals. The question now was whether this digital trail would be enough to identify Nightwatcher_503 in the real world, and whether they could be stopped before more young women disappeared into the darkness that seemed to follow their online activity. The task of identifying Nightwatcher_503 required Detective Chen to navigate the complex intersection of digital privacy rights and criminal investigation. While the users' posts were public, obtaining information about their identity and location would require legal warrants and cooperation from multiple technology companies. The process would be slow, methodical, and complicated by the user's apparent understanding of how to maintain anonymity online. Chen's first step was to work with the district attorney's office to obtain a warrant for Nightwatcher_503's Reddit account information. This would provide access to the IP addresses used to create and access the account, email addresses associated with the account, and any private messages the user might have sent or received. However, Reddit's data retention policies meant that some older information might no longer be available. While waiting for the warrant to be processed, Chen's team conducted a comprehensive analysis of Nightwatcher_503's public posting history. They used specialized software to analyze the user's writing patterns, looking for linguistic markers that might reveal information about their background, education, or geographic location. They also examined metadata from any images the user had posted, searching for hidden information that might have been inadvertently included. The linguistic analysis revealed several interesting patterns. Nightwatcher_503's writing showed signs of higher education, with sophisticated vocabulary and complex sentence structures. They occasionally used terminology that suggested familiarity with law enforcement procedures and forensic science. Most intriguingly, they sometimes used phrases or expressions that were particularly common in the Pacific Northwest, confirming Chen's suspicion that they were indeed a local resident. The user's knowledge of local geography was another telling factor. In discussions about various crimes, Nightwatcher_503 would often reference Portland area locations with the familiarity of someone who knew them well. They mentioned specific neighborhoods, landmarks, and even local transportation schedules with an accuracy that went beyond what someone could learn from maps or tourist information. When the Reddit warrant was finally approved and executed, the results were both helpful and frustrating. The account had been created using a temporary email address that was no longer active. The user had consistently accessed the account through VPN services and public Wi-Fi networks, making it difficult to trace their actual location. However, the IP address logs did reveal a pattern. Most logins occurred from locations in the Portland metropolitan area, confirming that Nightwatcher_503 was indeed a local resident. More significantly, the private message logs revealed that Nightwatcher_503 had been in direct contact with several other users, sharing more detailed information about criminal techniques than they posted publicly. These private conversations were even more disturbing than their public posts, featuring discussions about specific tools, locations, and methods for abducting and disposing of victims. One particular conversation stood out to Detective Chen. 3 weeks before Jennifer Morrison's disappearance, Nightwatcher_503 had sent a private message to another user who had posted about wanting to experience the ultimate crime story. The message read, "True understanding comes from participation, not observation." Some stories can only be told by those who write them. The recipient of this message had never responded, and their account had been deleted shortly afterward. Chen's team was able to trace this other account to a real identity, a 24-year-old man named David Park who had left Portland abruptly around the time Jennifer Morrison disappeared. Park had told friends and family he was taking a job in another state, but when investigators contacted his supposed new employer, they discovered no record of his employment. David Park had simply vanished from Portland at the same time that Nightwatcher_503's posting activity had become more sophisticated and frequent. The possibility that Nightwatcher_503 might have recruited an accomplice added a new dimension to the investigation. If David Park had been influenced by the user's online discussions to participate in actual crimes, it suggested that the forum posts weren't just documentation of criminal activity, they were potential recruitment tools, spreading dangerous ideas to vulnerable individuals. Chen expanded her investigation to examine other users who had engaged with Nightwatcher_503's posts. She looked for patterns in who they contacted privately, who responded enthusiastically to their more extreme posts, and who might have been influenced by their apparent expertise in criminal methodology. What she found was a network of users who had gradually been exposed to increasingly explicit discussions about violence, manipulation, and murder. Most of these users appeared to be ordinary true crime fans who were simply engaging with content that interested them. But a few showed concerning patterns in their own posting behavior after extended interactions with Nightwatcher_503. They began asking more technical questions about criminal methods, showing increased interest in cases involving missing persons rather than solved murders, and demonstrating knowledge that seemed to go beyond casual consumption of true crime media. One user, going by Silent Student, had begun posting detailed theories about how the Portland missing persons cases might have been executed. Their analysis was sophisticated and showed inside knowledge of investigative procedures. Most disturbing, Silent Student had posted a comment suggesting that Ashley Chen's disappearance showed significant improvement in technique compared to the earlier cases. This comment had been posted before police had publicly acknowledged any connection between the three missing women cases. The fact that Silent Student was analyzing them as connected crimes, and commenting on the evolution of the perpetrators' methods, suggested that they had information that hadn't been released to the public. Detective Chen realized that her investigation had uncovered something unprecedented in her career. The true crime community had been infiltrated and manipulated by someone who wasn't just consuming content about murder, they were creating it. They were using the forum not only to refine their own criminal skills but potentially to influence others to join them in crossing the line from fantasy to reality. The digital forensics had revealed a web of online relationships and influences that extended far beyond a simple case of missing persons. Chen was looking at evidence of what might be the first documented case of social media being used to systematically recruit accomplices for serial crimes. The traditional model of the lone wolf killer was evolving into something more complex and more dangerous, a distributed network of individuals who were sharing knowledge, techniques, and potentially participating in coordinated criminal activity. But despite all the digital evidence, Chen still didn't have the real-world identity of Nightwatcher_503. The user had been careful to maintain their anonymity, and the technical evidence alone wouldn't be enough to make an arrest. She would need to find a way to connect their online activity to physical evidence in the real world. The question was whether that evidence still existed, or whether Nightwatcher_503's expertise in disposal techniques had eliminated any traces of their actual crimes. The breakthrough in identifying Nightwatcher_503 came from an unexpected source, a mistake that even the most careful criminals sometimes make. While analyzing the metadata from images that various users had posted in the forum, Detective Chen's cybercrimes team discovered that one image shared by Nightwatcher_503 contained embedded GPS coordinates. The user had posted a photograph of a book recommendation, trying to show other users the specific edition they were referring to. Hidden in the image file was location data indicating that the photo had been taken at a specific address in southeast Portland. The photograph had been posted 8 months earlier, and Nightwatcher_503 had apparently realized their mistake shortly afterward. All subsequent images they shared had been carefully scrubbed of any identifying metadata. But this single oversight had given investigators the first concrete clue to their real-world location. The GPS coordinates led to a small apartment building in the Hawthorne district, a trendy neighborhood known for its eclectic mix of young professionals, artists, and students. Chen obtained a warrant to investigate the building's tenant records, looking for anyone who might match the profile they had developed of Nightwatcher_503. The building housed 12 units, with a mix of single professionals and couples. Chen's team carefully researched each tenant, looking for someone with the education, interests, and behavioral patterns that matched their suspect. Most of the residents had active social media profiles and normal patterns of employment and social interaction. But one tenant stood out as a possible match. Unit 3B was rented to someone named Marcus Hoffman, a 28-year-old who worked as a freelance technical writer. Unlike the other tenants, Hoffman maintained almost no online presence under his real name. He had no Facebook profile, no Instagram account, no LinkedIn page despite working in a field where professional networking was essential. His rental application listed him as self-employed, and his landlord described him as quiet, punctual with rent payments, and someone who mostly kept to himself. Chen's investigation into Hoffman's background revealed several concerning details. He had moved to Portland 3 years earlier from Seattle, shortly after dropping out of a graduate program in forensic psychology at the University of Washington. His former classmates described him as brilliant but unsettling, someone who seemed more interested in understanding criminal behavior than preventing or solving crimes. One professor recalled that Hoffman had been asked to leave the program after expressing what the faculty considered inappropriate enthusiasm for studying violent offenders. Hoffman's work as a technical writer specialized in creating documentation for law enforcement software and forensic equipment companies. This career path had given him extensive knowledge of investigative techniques, evidence analysis procedures, and the technical capabilities of modern police work. He essentially had insider knowledge of how criminal investigations were conducted, knowledge that would be invaluable to someone trying to commit crimes without getting caught. Surveillance of Hoffman's daily routine revealed patterns that aligned perfectly with Detective Chen's analysis of Nightwatcher_503's online behavior. Hoffman worked from home most days, but would often spend his evenings riding Portland's public transportation system with his laptop, posting to Reddit and other forums from various locations around the city. His travel patterns took him through all 3 areas where the missing women were last seen. Most significantly, surveillance teams observed Hoffman spending considerable time in locations where young women would be likely to establish predictable routines. He frequented coffee shops near college campuses, bookstores where students worked part-time jobs, and transit stations during peak commuting hours. He appeared to be conducting systematic observation of potential victims, exactly as Chen had theorized based on his online posts about victim selection methodology. But observation alone wasn't enough to arrest Hoffman or search his apartment. Chen needed more concrete evidence linking him to the disappearances of Jennifer Morrison, Maria Santos, and Ashley Chen. She decided to attempt a digital sting operation, using an undercover officer to engage with Nightwatcher_503 online and try to elicit information that could be used to obtain search warrants. Detective Lisa Rodriguez, who specialized in online undercover operations, created a fake account and began participating in the true crime forum's discussions. Her character was designed to appeal to Nightwatcher_503's apparent interest in recruiting like-minded individuals, someone who expressed frustration with the limitations of consuming true crime content rather than participating in it. Rodriguez's fake persona, Curious Observer, began by making increasingly bold comments about wanting to understand crime from the perpetrator's perspective rather than just the investigator's viewpoint. She praised Nightwatcher_503's insights and eventually sent them a private message expressing interest in moving beyond theoretical discussions. Nightwatcher_503's response was cautious but intriguing. They sent Curious Observer a series of questions designed to test their seriousness and commitment. The questions revealed a sophisticated understanding of operational security, criminal psychology, and the challenges of avoiding detection. More importantly, they included specific references to Portland area locations and techniques that were clearly based on first-hand experience rather than research. Over several weeks of careful communication, Nightwatcher_503 began to reveal more specific information about their activities. They described field work they had conducted in the Portland area, using language that was clearly euphemistic but unmistakably referred to actual crimes. They mentioned specific challenges they had encountered with subject acquisition and evidence management that aligned perfectly with the investigative challenges Chen's team had faced in the missing persons cases. The breakthrough came when Nightwatcher_503 offered to show curious observer practical applications of the techniques they had been discussing. They suggested meeting in person at a location where they could demonstrate site selection and subject assessment procedures. The meeting was proposed for a Thursday evening at a downtown Portland transit station, the same day of the week and type of location where Jennifer Morrison had disappeared. Detective Chen realized that Nightwatcher_503 was planning to use the meeting as an opportunity to abduct Rodriguez, possibly intending to kill her or recruit her as an accomplice in killing someone else. The level of danger was extreme, but it also represented the best opportunity they would have to gather concrete evidence and prevent future crimes. The operation required careful planning to ensure Rodriguez's safety while maximizing the chance of gathering evidence that would hold up in court. Surveillance teams were positioned throughout the meeting location, recording equipment was concealed on Rodriguez's person, and backup officers were stationed at multiple exit routes to prevent Nightwatcher_503 from escaping if the situation went wrong. As the meeting time approached, Chen felt the weight of all the investigative work that had led to this moment. 3 women had already disappeared, possibly killed by someone who had used their shared interest in true crime to perfect their criminal methodology. The next few hours would determine whether justice could be achieved for Jennifer Morrison, Maria Santos, and Ashley Chen, and whether other potential victims could be saved from a killer who had hidden among those who studied the very crimes he was committing. The evening of the planned meeting arrived with typical Portland weather, a steady drizzle that created halos around the streetlights and sent commuters hurrying through the downtown transit station with their heads down. Detective Rodriguez, wearing a concealed recording device and maintaining constant radio contact with her backup team, positioned herself at the predetermined meeting location near the Max light rail platform. At exactly 6:30 p.m., she spotted someone matching Marcus Hoffman's description approaching through the crowd of evening commuters. He was carrying a laptop bag and scanning the area with the careful attention of someone who understood surveillance techniques. Rodriguez noted that he had chosen his approach route to pass through blind spots in the station's security camera coverage, behavior that demonstrated the technical knowledge they expected from Nightwatcher_503. Hoffman approached Rodriguez with the cautious confidence of someone who had done this before. He greeted her using the agreed-upon phrases from their online communication, confirming that he was indeed Nightwatcher_503. His demeanor was calm and controlled, showing none of the nervousness that most people would feel when meeting an online contact for the first time. This level of composure suggested experience with similar encounters, possibly including meetings with his previous victims. Rodriguez played her role perfectly, expressing enthusiasm for learning from someone with Hoffman's apparent expertise. She asked about his field work and his methods for subject selection, using the euphemistic language that he seemed to prefer. Hoffman responded with increasing specificity, describing techniques for identifying vulnerable targets and approaches for gaining their trust. As their conversation continued, Hoffman began to reveal details that only the perpetrator of the Portland disappearances could know. He mentioned that college students made ideal subjects because their schedules were predictable but their social connections were often loose enough that their absence might not be immediately noticed. He described the importance of choosing locations near public transportation where a subject could be quickly moved without arousing suspicion. Most damaging to his case, Hoffman began to reference specific details from each of the 3 missing persons cases. He mentioned that bookstore employees often worked alone during closing hours, a detail that applied directly to Jennifer Morrison's situation. He discussed how art students could be manipulated through fake commission opportunities, precisely the method that appeared to have been used to lure Maria Santos. He even referenced the specific library where Ashley Chen had been studying before her disappearance, describing it as an ideal hunting ground because of its late hours and isolated parking areas. Rodriguez carefully guided the conversation toward getting Hoffman to reveal information about what had happened to the missing women. When she asked about disposal methods, Hoffman's eyes lit up with what she later described as genuine enthusiasm. He began to describe techniques for ensuring that evidence would never be found, speaking with the detailed knowledge that could only come from practical experience. The key is understanding the local geography, Hoffman explained, apparently forgetting to maintain his usual operational security in his excitement to share his expertise. Oregon has so many remote areas, old logging roads, abandoned sites from the timber industry. If you know where to look, you can find places where no one will ever think to search. Rodriguez pressed for more specific information, and Hoffman began to describe locations where he claimed to have conducted his disposal operations. He mentioned specific landmarks, road conditions, and seasonal access patterns that demonstrated intimate familiarity with areas outside Portland where bodies could be hidden indefinitely. His descriptions were so detailed that Detective Chen, monitoring the conversation from a nearby surveillance van, realized they would be able to use this information to locate the remains of his victims. But as the conversation continued, Rodriguez began to sense that something was changing in Hoffman's demeanor. He started asking more specific questions about her background, her technical knowledge, and her commitment to moving forward with what he called their collaboration. His questions became increasingly pointed, suggesting that he might be becoming suspicious of her true identity. Chen, listening to the conversation through Rodriguez's concealed microphone, realized that they had gathered enough evidence for an arrest warrant, but she was concerned about her officer's safety as Hoffman's suspicion seemed to grow. The original plan had been to let the meeting continue until Hoffman attempted to move Rodriguez to a secondary location, where they could arrest him in the act of attempted kidnapping. But his increasing wariness suggested that he might be preparing to flee rather than proceed with his intended crime. The situation reached a critical point when Hoffman suddenly stopped talking and began examining the area around them with obvious concern. He had apparently spotted something, possibly one of the surveillance team members, that had triggered his suspicions. Rodriguez could see the moment when he realized that their meeting was not what it appeared to be. "I think we should continue this conversation somewhere more private," Hoffman said, his tone becoming noticeably more tense. He started moving toward one of the station exits, gesturing for Rodriguez to follow him. This was the moment Chen had been waiting for, evidence that Hoffman intended to abduct Rodriguez, giving them grounds for immediate arrest. But instead of following Hoffman toward the exit, Rodriguez made a split-second decision that probably saved her life. She suddenly stepped backward and loudly said, "Police officer, you're under arrest," while simultaneously signaling to her backup team. The arrest signal immediately brought plainclothes officers converging on their location from multiple directions. Hoffman's reaction confirmed everything the investigation had suggested about his dangerous nature. Rather than showing surprise or attempting to flee, he immediately reached into his laptop bag and pulled out what appeared to be a weapon. The surveillance team later determined that he had been carrying zip ties, chloroform, and a stun gun, equipment clearly intended for incapacitating and abducting Rodriguez. The arrest was swift but intense, with Hoffman resisting violently as officers attempted to restrain him. During the struggle, he repeatedly shouted that the police didn't understand what he was doing and that his work was too important to be stopped by people who only saw the surface level. His words revealed the psychological framework he had constructed to justify his crimes, viewing himself as some kind of researcher or artist rather than a serial killer. Marcus Hoffman's arrest marked the beginning of what would become one of the most complex interrogations in Portland Police Bureau history. The suspect was clearly intelligent, educated, and sophisticated in his understanding of both criminal methodology and police procedures. Traditional interrogation techniques would likely be ineffective against someone who had spent years studying law enforcement from the inside, learning about investigative procedures through his technical writing work and true crime research. Detective Chen decided to approach the interrogation from an angle that played to Hoffman's apparent ego and desire to be recognized for his intellectual sophistication. Rather than treating him as a common criminal, she positioned herself as someone who was genuinely interested in understanding his methodology and motivations. This approach was morally difficult for Chen, as it required her to show apparent respect for someone she believed had murdered 3 innocent women. But it was strategically necessary if she wanted to recover the victims' remains and ensure that Hoffman couldn't claim insanity or diminished capacity. The interrogation took place over several days, with Chen carefully building rapport with Hoffman while gradually introducing evidence from the investigation. She began by acknowledging his technical expertise and the sophistication of his online research, treating his forum posts as academic work rather than criminal planning. This approach immediately caught Hoffman's attention, as he seemed starved for recognition of what he viewed as his intellectual accomplishments. "Your analysis of investigative blind spots was remarkably accurate," Chen told him during their second interrogation session. "The way you identified patterns in successful versus unsuccessful criminal cases showed genuine insight into law enforcement methodology." This praise was technically true, but it served to encourage Hoffman to continue explaining his thought processes and decision-making. Hoffman responded enthusiastically to this approach, clearly pleased to have his work taken seriously by a law enforcement professional. He began to explain how he had developed his expertise, describing his academic background in forensic psychology and his professional work documenting police procedures. He spoke about his research with the detached analytical tone of a scholar discussing their dissertation topic. "The problem with most criminals is that they operate emotionally rather than systematically," Hoffman explained to Chen. "They make impulsive decisions, they leave evidence because they don't understand forensic capabilities, they choose victims and locations without proper analysis of risk factors. I approached this as a research problem, how to optimize outcomes while minimizing detection probability." Chen carefully guided the conversation toward specific details about the missing women, framing her questions as professional curiosity about his methodology rather than attempts to gather evidence for prosecution. She asked about his victim selection criteria, his approach to initial contact, and his techniques for moving subjects without detection. Hoffman responded with detailed explanations that demonstrated clear premeditation and sophisticated planning. Jennifer Morrison was essentially a test case, Hoffman admitted during their third session. "I had identified her through systematic observation of potential subjects in the downtown area. Bookstore employees working evening shifts presented optimal conditions, predictable schedules, minimal security presence, established routines that could be disrupted without immediate notice. The execution went exactly as planned, validating my theoretical framework." Chen noticed that Hoffman consistently referred to his victims as subjects and his crimes as executions of planned operations. This clinical language seemed to be more than just an attempt to sanitize his actions, it appeared to reflect how he actually conceptualized what he was doing. He had constructed a psychological framework that allowed him to view murder as research, eliminating the emotional and moral dimensions that would normally create guilt or hesitation. When Chen asked about Maria Santos, Hoffman's description became even more detailed and disturbing. "The second operation incorporated lessons learned from the first," he explained. "I had identified weaknesses in my initial approach, too much reliance on circumstantial factors, insufficient control over the subject's communications prior to acquisition. Maria Santos presented an opportunity to test improved methodology." Hoffman described how he had researched Santos's artistic work online, then created a fake identity as a potential client interested in commissioning a piece. He had spent weeks building a relationship with her through email and text messages, establishing trust and familiarity before arranging their meeting. This approach had given him much better control over the circumstances of her disappearance, allowing him to manipulate both the timing and location of their encounter. The technical challenge was maintaining the false identity while ensuring that the communications couldn't be traced back to me, Hoffman continued. "I used a combination of VPN services, disposable email accounts, and purchased burner phones. The key was creating enough authentic interaction to establish credibility without leaving digital footprints that could survive forensic analysis." Chen realized that Hoffman was essentially providing a tutorial in how to commit untraceable crimes, sharing techniques that he had developed through practical experience. His willingness to explain these methods in detail suggested both arrogance and a desire for recognition that was stronger than his concern about legal consequences. The discussion of Ashley Chen's case revealed the full extent of Hoffman's systematic approach to serial killing. "By the third operation, I had refined the methodology to near-optimal efficiency," he told Chen with obvious pride. "Subject selection, approach strategy, acquisition technique, transportation method, disposal procedures. Every element had been analyzed and improved based on empirical results from previous operations. Hoffman described how he had identified Ashley Chen through systematic surveillance of the OHSU campus, tracking her daily routines and identifying optimal intervention points. He had chosen to approach her in the library parking lot because his analysis of security camera coverage revealed blind spots that would prevent his identification. He had timed the encounter to coincide with a shift change in campus security, creating a window of opportunity where response time would be delayed. The disposal methodology had also been significantly improved, Hoffman continued, apparently oblivious to the horror of what he was describing. I had identified multiple sites in the Cascade foothills where geological conditions would accelerate decomposition while seasonal weather patterns would eliminate surface evidence. The locations were chosen based on analysis of search patterns used in previous missing persons cases, ensuring that standard investigative procedures would be unlikely to discover the remains. By the end of the fourth interrogation session, Chen had obtained detailed confessions to all 3 murders, along with specific information about disposal locations that would allow recovery of the victims' remains. But perhaps most significantly, she had gained insight into a new type of criminal mind, someone who had used the digital age's information resources to transform serial killing from an emotional crime of opportunity into a systematic process of research, development, and refinement. Hoffman represented an evolution in criminal behavior that law enforcement was only beginning to understand. His case would require investigators to develop new approaches for identifying and stopping killers who used social media and online communities not just as hunting grounds, but as educational resources for perfecting their techniques. The information Marcus Hoffman provided during his confession led Detective Chen and her team to 3 remote locations in the Cascade Mountains east of Portland. Each site had been chosen with the same systematic precision that characterized all of Hoffman's criminal activities, selected based on factors including seasonal accessibility, natural decomposition conditions, and distance from established search patterns used by law enforcement. The first location was where Jennifer Morrison's remains were buried, approximately 40 miles east of Portland on an abandoned logging road that had been closed to vehicle traffic for over a decade. Hoffman had discovered the site through his research into historical timber industry operations in Oregon, identifying areas that had once been commercially active but were now essentially forgotten by both government agencies and recreational users. The recovery operation required specialized equipment and personnel, including cadaver dogs, forensic anthropologists, and crime scene technicians experienced in processing decomposed remains. The terrain was difficult, requiring investigators to hike nearly 2 miles through dense forest to reach the burial site that Hoffman had described in his confession. When they finally located the site, the recovery team found that Hoffman's descriptions had been meticulously accurate. Jennifer Morrison's remains were buried exactly where he had indicated, at a depth and in conditions that matched his detailed account of the disposal procedure. Even in death, his victims had been treated as experimental subjects, with their burial designed to test theories about decomposition rates and evidence preservation in Pacific Northwest soil conditions. The forensic analysis of Jennifer Morrison's remains confirmed the systematic nature of Hoffman's crimes while providing heartbreaking evidence of her final moments. The medical examiner determined that she had been killed by asphyxiation, using techniques that were designed to minimize physical evidence while ensuring rapid death. Personal items found with her body included her bookstore name tag and the keys to her car, items that Hoffman had kept as trophies before ultimately deciding that they posed too great a risk for detection. Maria Santos's remains were located at the second site Hoffman had described, buried in a ravine approximately 60 miles southeast of Portland. This location had been even more carefully selected than the first, situated in an area where seasonal flooding would periodically wash over the burial site, accelerating decomposition and dispersing any surface evidence that might otherwise attract attention from hikers or wildlife officials. The recovery of Maria's remains was complicated by the environmental conditions Hoffman had deliberately chosen for the site. Heavy rains had caused significant erosion in the ravine, and the forensic team had to carefully excavate a wide area to ensure that all evidence was recovered. Despite these challenges, they were able to recover enough of her remains to confirm her identity and determine the cause of death. Like Jennifer Morrison, Maria Santos had been killed by asphyxiation using techniques that demonstrated Hoffman's evolving expertise in minimizing forensic evidence. However, items found with her body suggested that she had been kept alive for several days before being killed, possibly while Hoffman conducted what he later described as behavioral research into victim psychology under stress. The third site, where Ashley Chen's remains were buried, was the most remote and carefully concealed of the three locations. Situated more than 70 miles from Portland in a section of national forest land that was rarely visited by officials or recreational users, the site demonstrated the full extent of Hoffman's systematic approach to body disposal. Ashley's burial site had been prepared in advance, with Hoffman apparently visiting the location multiple times to dig the grave, test soil conditions, and ensure that the site would remain undetected indefinitely. The forensic team found evidence that he had used lime and other chemicals to accelerate decomposition, treating the disposal process as a scientific experiment rather than simply an attempt to hide evidence. The forensic analysis of all three burial sites revealed that Hoffman had been conducting what amounted to a systematic study of decomposition, disposal techniques, and evidence degradation. Each site incorporated lessons learned from the previous ones, with improved methods for accelerating decomposition, minimizing forensic evidence, and ensuring long-term concealment. The progression from Jennifer Morrison's burial to Ashley Chen's demonstrated a learning curve that treated murder as an iterative process of research and development. Perhaps most disturbing was the discovery that Hoffman had been documenting his disposal procedures through detailed photographs and written notes that were later found during the search of his apartment. These materials revealed that he viewed the burial sites as ongoing experiments, returning to check on decomposition progress and environmental factors that might affect evidence preservation. The investigation team also discovered that Hoffman had been using information from these return visits to refine his advice to other users in online true crime forums. His posts about disposal techniques weren't just theoretical discussions, they were based on empirical data he had collected from his actual crimes. He had been sharing practical knowledge gained through murder, teaching other potential killers techniques that he had personally tested and validated. The recovery of all three victims' remains provided closure for their families while also revealing the full scope of Hoffman's systematic approach to serial killing. But the investigation also raised troubling questions about how many other people might have been influenced by his online sharing of criminal techniques, and whether his methods might have been adopted by other potential killers who had learned from his forum posts. Detective Chen realized that Hoffman's case represented more than just a traditional serial killer investigation. It was evidence of how digital communities and information sharing could be weaponized by criminals in ways that law enforcement was only beginning to understand. The case would require new approaches to monitoring online criminal activity and identifying individuals who might be using social media platforms to research, plan, and coordinate violent crimes. The investigation into Marcus Hoffman's online activities revealed a disturbing network of individuals who had been influenced by his systematic approach to criminal methodology. As Detective Chen's cyber crimes team analyzed the forum posts and private messages associated with Nightwatcher_503, they discovered that Hoffman hadn't been working entirely alone, he had been mentoring other users in techniques for abduction, disposal, and avoiding detection. The missing David Park, whose account had been deleted shortly after receiving private messages from Hoffman, became the focus of an intensive multi-state investigation. FBI analysts were brought in to help track Park's movements after he disappeared from Portland, using financial records, surveillance footage, and digital forensics to trace his path across the country. What they discovered was deeply troubling. Park had not simply left Portland to take a job elsewhere, as he had told friends and family. Instead, he had been systematically traveling through smaller cities in the Pacific Northwest, apparently applying techniques he had learned from Hoffman to commit his own series of crimes. Bank records showed that he had been making cash withdrawals in cities where young women had been reported missing over the previous 8 months. The pattern was subtle enough that individual law enforcement agencies hadn't connected the cases. Park had been careful to target victims in different jurisdictions, ensuring that no single agency would see enough disappearances to recognize a serial pattern. But when FBI analysts compiled missing persons reports from across Oregon, Washington, and Northern California, a clear trail emerged following Park's documented movements. 7 young women had disappeared in cities where Park had been present during the timeframe following his contact with Hoffman. Like Hoffman's victims, these women were all college students or recent graduates, all disappeared from locations near public transportation, and all had left behind no physical evidence of their fate. The similarities in victim selection and disposal methodology suggested that Park had been carefully following the techniques that Hoffman had shared through their private communications. The investigation also revealed that Silent Student, the forum user who had demonstrated inside knowledge about the Portland cases, was actually a third individual who had been influenced by Hoffman's online mentoring. Digital forensics traced this account to Rachel Kim, a 25-year-old graduate student in criminal justice at Portland State University who had become obsessed with Hoffman's analytical approach to understanding criminal behavior. Kim's apartment, searched under warrant, contained extensive notes and research materials related to the missing women cases. She had been conducting her own analysis of Hoffman's techniques, apparently viewing his crimes as case studies for her academic work in criminal psychology. But her research had crossed the line from academic study into active participation. Investigators found evidence that she had been conducting surveillance of potential victims in the Portland area, using methods similar to those Hoffman had described in his forum posts. Most disturbing, Kim had been documenting her surveillance activities through detailed photographs and notes, creating what amounted to a target assessment database of young women in the Portland area. Her files contained information about dozens of potential victims, including their daily routines, work schedules, social connections, and vulnerability factors. She appeared to be preparing to commit crimes of her own, or possibly to provide target information to other members of the network. The discovery of Kim's involvement revealed that Hoffman's influence had extended beyond individual recruitment to the creation of what investigators began to recognize as a distributed criminal network. Forum users were sharing not just techniques and advice, but actual intelligence about potential victims and optimal locations for criminal activity. The traditional model of the lone serial killer was evolving into something far more dangerous: coordinated criminal activity that used social media platforms for organization and communication. Chen's team identified at least 12 other forum users who had engaged in private communications with Nightwatcher_503 and demonstrated concerning changes in their posting behavior after those interactions. These users had begun asking increasingly technical questions about criminal methods, showing knowledge that went beyond casual true crime consumption, and in some cases, expressing interest in field research that suggested they might be planning to move from observation to participation. The investigation expanded to include FBI behavioral analysts who specialized in online radicalization and recruitment patterns. They determined that Hoffman had been using techniques similar to those employed by terrorist organizations and other extremist groups, gradually exposing susceptible individuals to increasingly violent content while providing them with ideological frameworks that justified crossing legal and moral boundaries. But instead of political or religious ideology, Hoffman had used intellectual curiosity and academic interest as his recruitment tools. He had identified individuals who were genuinely interested in understanding criminal behavior, then gradually introduced them to more practical and applied knowledge until they became willing participants in actual crimes. The true crime community's legitimate interest in understanding murder had been weaponized into a recruitment mechanism for creating new killers. The network analysis revealed that this type of online criminal recruitment might be more widespread than law enforcement had previously recognized. Similar patterns of influence and radicalization were identified in other online communities focused on violence, death, and criminal activity. Social media platforms that had been designed to connect people with shared interests were being systematically exploited by criminals to identify, recruit, and train accomplices. David Park was eventually located and arrested in Northern California, where he had been planning what investigators believed would have been his 8th abduction. Surveillance equipment found in his vehicle, along with detailed notes about local college students, suggested that he had been preparing to continue the pattern of crimes he had learned from Hoffman. His arrest prevented what would likely have been another murder while providing investigators with additional evidence about the network's operations and methodology. Rachel Kim was arrested on charges related to stalking and conspiracy, based on evidence of her surveillance activities and communication with other network members. Her academic research had provided valuable insights into criminal psychology, but she had used that knowledge to cross the line from understanding violence to facilitating it. Her case raised difficult questions about the ethical boundaries of academic research into criminal behavior and the responsibility of educational institutions to monitor students who showed unhealthy fascination with violent crime. The unraveling of Hoffman's network ultimately led to the identification and arrest of 6 individuals in 4 states who had been influenced by his online mentoring to commit or plan violent crimes. The investigation revealed that the true crime community, despite its legitimate interest in understanding and preventing violence, had been successfully infiltrated and exploited by individuals who used shared academic interest as a cover for criminal activity. The case forced law enforcement to confront new challenges in identifying and preventing criminal activity that used social media platforms for organization, recruitment, and training. Traditional investigative methods had to be supplemented with digital forensics, behavioral analysis, and multi-jurisdictional coordination to address crimes that transcended geographical boundaries and used technology to avoid detection. The psychological evaluation of Marcus Hoffman, conducted by Dr. Sarah Martinez, a forensic psychologist specializing in serial killer behavior, revealed a criminal mind that had been shaped by the digital age in unprecedented ways. Unlike traditional serial killers who typically operated in isolation, developing their methods through trial and error, Hoffman had used online communities to accelerate his learning curve and refine his techniques through systematic research and collaboration. Dr. Martinez's analysis revealed that Hoffman exhibited many characteristics consistent with psychopathy: lack of empathy, grandiose self-regard, manipulative behavior, and absence of genuine remorse for his actions. However, his case also demonstrated how these traits could be amplified and channeled through digital platforms in ways that traditional psychological profiles hadn't anticipated. The Internet had provided him with both research tools and validation mechanisms that allowed him to develop his criminal expertise far more rapidly than would have been possible in previous generations. Traditional serial killers often struggle with isolation and the burden of their secret knowledge, Dr. Martinez explained in her evaluation report. They may feel compelled to reveal themselves through letters to newspapers or taunting communications with police, driven by a desire for recognition that ultimately leads to their capture. Hoffman found a way to share his expertise and receive validation while maintaining complete anonymity, creating a psychological framework that was much more sustainable and difficult to detect. The True Crime Forum had provided Hoffman with a community of individuals who shared his fascination with murder, creating an environment where his increasingly sophisticated knowledge would be praised rather than questioned. His posts about criminal methodology were received as intellectual insights by other users, feeding his narcissistic need for admiration while reinforcing his view of himself as a superior intellect who understood aspects of human behavior that others could only theorize about. Dr. Martinez identified that Hoffman had constructed elaborate psychological rationalizations for his crimes, viewing them not as murder but as research that contributed to humanity's understanding of criminal behavior. He genuinely believed that his systematic approach to killing was academically valuable, and that his victims were willing participants in advancing scientific knowledge about violence and death. This delusional framework had allowed him to commit increasingly brutal crimes without experiencing the guilt or psychological deterioration that typically affects serial killers over time. The evaluation also revealed that Hoffman's technical background had fundamentally altered his approach to serial killing. His work documenting law enforcement procedures for software companies had given him insider knowledge of investigative capabilities, allowing him to stay ahead of detection methods in ways that previous generations of killers could never achieve. He understood digital forensics, surveillance techniques, and evidence analysis procedures well enough to systematically avoid leaving traces that traditional investigations could follow. Hoffman represents a new category of criminal, Dr. Martinez concluded. He combined the systematic methodology of an organized serial killer with the technical sophistication of a cybercriminal and the community resources of online collaboration. This combination created someone who was far more dangerous and difficult to detect than traditional criminal profiles would predict. The psychological analysis of David Park revealed a different but equally concerning pattern of digital radicalization. Park had initially been a genuine true crime enthusiast with no apparent predisposition toward violence. His academic record, employment history, and social relationships all suggested a normal, functioning individual with legitimate intellectual interests in criminal psychology. However, Dr. Martinez's evaluation showed that Park had gradually been influenced by Hoffman's systematic approach to murder, eventually adopting the same psychological frameworks that allowed Hoffman to justify his crimes. The process had been gradual and subtle, beginning with academic discussions about criminal methodology and slowly evolving into practical planning for actual crimes. Park's transformation demonstrated how online mentoring could be used to radicalize individuals who had no initial intention of becoming criminals themselves. Park's case shows how effective online grooming can be when it targets intellectual rather than emotional vulnerabilities, Dr. Martinez explained. Instead of using traditional manipulation techniques like emotional dependency or sexual exploitation, Hoffman appealed to Park's academic curiosity and desire to understand complex subjects. This approach was much more subtle and harder to recognize, both for Park himself and for anyone who might have observed his behavior changes. The evaluation of Rachel Kim revealed yet another pattern of digital influence that had transformed legitimate academic interest into criminal planning. Kim's graduate studies in criminal justice had provided her with extensive knowledge of investigative procedures and criminal behavior, knowledge that she had initially intended to use for academic and professional purposes. But her interaction with Hoffman's online content had gradually shifted her perspective from preventing crime to understanding how to commit it more effectively. Kim's case was particularly troubling because it demonstrated how educational institutions might inadvertently provide criminals with research resources and academic frameworks that could be used to plan and execute violent crimes. Her thesis research on victim selection patterns in serial killing cases had essentially provided her with a roadmap for identifying vulnerable targets, while her criminology coursework had taught her about investigative blind spots that could be exploited to avoid detection. Dr. Martinez's comprehensive analysis of the network revealed that Hoffman had successfully identified and exploited psychological vulnerabilities that were specific to the digital age. The anonymity of online interaction had allowed him to present himself as a mentor and expert without revealing his true nature, while the vast information resources of the internet had provided him with research tools that previous generations of criminals could never access. The combination of these factors had created what Dr. Martinez termed distributed criminal learning, where knowledge about violent crime could be systematically shared, refined, and applied across multiple individuals and jurisdictions. Traditional law enforcement approaches, which assumed that serial killers worked in isolation and developed their methods through personal experience, were inadequate for addressing criminals who used online collaboration to accelerate their learning and improve their techniques. The psychological profiles also revealed that the network members shared certain characteristics that made them susceptible to Hoffman's influence. They were typically intelligent individuals with above-average education, genuine intellectual curiosity about criminal behavior, and social isolation that made online communities particularly important to their sense of identity and belonging. These traits, which would normally be considered positive, had been weaponized by Hoffman to recruit accomplices and spread criminal methodology. Dr. Martinez's evaluation concluded that the case represented a fundamental shift in criminal behavior that would require new approaches from both law enforcement and mental health professionals. The traditional model of the isolated serial killer was being replaced by networked criminal activity that used digital platforms for research, recruitment, and coordination. Understanding and preventing this new form of criminal behavior would require interdisciplinary collaboration between psychologists, law enforcement, and technology experts who could address both the human and technical aspects of digital predation. The prosecution of Marcus Hoffman presented unique challenges for the district attorney's office, requiring them to build cases that incorporated both traditional physical evidence and unprecedented digital forensics. Lead prosecutor Jennifer Walsh faced the complex task of explaining to a jury how online forum posts and private messages could constitute evidence of premeditated murder, while also demonstrating the systematic nature of Hoffman's crimes across multiple jurisdictions and digital platforms. The charges against Hoffman included 3 counts of first-degree murder, multiple counts of kidnapping, and conspiracy charges related to his online mentoring of other criminals. The prosecution strategy was to present Hoffman not as a traditional serial killer driven by psychological compulsion, but as someone who had methodically planned and executed a series of murders while using digital platforms to refine his techniques and recruit accomplices. Walsh's opening statement to the jury emphasized the unprecedented nature of the case, explaining how Hoffman had used the internet to transform serial killing from an isolated criminal activity into a collaborative research project. She described how his forum posts weren't just expressions of interest in true crime, but actual documentation of criminal methodology based on his personal experience with murder and body disposal. The defendant didn't just consume content about violent crime, Walsh told the jury. He created it. Every recommendation he made, every technique he praised, every insight he shared was based on knowledge gained through the systematic murder of 3 innocent women. He turned their deaths into educational content for other potential killers, sharing their suffering as if it were academic research. The prosecution's case relied heavily on digital evidence that required extensive explanation to help the jury understand how online activity could constitute proof of real-world crimes. Computer forensics experts testified about the correlation between Hoffman's posting activity and the dates of the disappearances, demonstrating how his online behavior had changed following each murder in ways that reflected his growing expertise and confidence. Detective Chen's testimony was central to the prosecution's case, as she walked the jury through the investigative process that had led from analyzing forum posts to recovering the victims' remains. She explained how traditional investigative methods had been insufficient for solving the cases, and how digital forensics had been necessary to identify patterns and connections that weren't visible through conventional evidence analysis. The defendant's online activity provided a window into his criminal methodology that we'd never seen before in a serial killer case, Chen testified. His posts documented not just what he had done, but how he had done it and how he planned to improve his techniques for future crimes. He was essentially keeping a public research journal of his criminal activities, hidden in plain sight among thousands of other true crime enthusiasts. The forensic evidence from the burial sites provided crucial physical confirmation of the digital evidence, demonstrating that Hoffman's online descriptions of disposal techniques were based on actual experience rather than theoretical knowledge. Medical examiner testimony established the cause of death for all 3 victims while also revealing the systematic progression in Hoffman's methods, showing how each murder had incorporated lessons learned from the previous ones. The prosecution also presented evidence about Hoffman's network of online contacts, demonstrating how he had used private messages to recruit and influence other individuals to commit similar crimes. The arrests of David Park and Rachel Kim provided concrete evidence that Hoffman's online activity had directly led to additional criminal planning and activity in other jurisdictions. Defense attorney Michael Torres faced the challenging task of representing a client whose own words and actions had provided extensive evidence of his guilt. Torres's strategy focused on arguing that Hoffman's online posts were fantasy rather than documentation of actual crimes, and that the prosecution was criminalizing academic interest in criminal methodology rather than proving actual murder. My client's online activity reflects someone with a deep intellectual interest in understanding criminal behavior, Torres argued in his opening statement. Academic discussion of criminal methodology isn't evidence of criminal activity. The prosecution wants you to convict Marcus Hoffman for his thoughts and interests, not for any actual crimes they can prove he committed. However, this defense strategy was severely undermined by the recovery of the victims' remains at locations that Hoffman had described with perfect accuracy during his confession. The defense was forced to acknowledge that Hoffman had indeed killed the 3 women, shifting their strategy to argue for diminished capacity based on his delusional belief that he was conducting legitimate research rather than committing murder. Dr. Martinez's psychological evaluation became a key element of both the prosecution and defense cases, with each side interpreting her findings differently. The prosecution argued that her analysis demonstrated Hoffman's sophistication and premeditation, showing that he had carefully constructed psychological rationalizations to justify his crimes while maintaining the ability to plan and execute them systematically. The defense argued that the same evaluation proved that Hoffman genuinely believed he was conducting academic research, and that his delusional framework prevented him from understanding the true nature of his actions. They contended that his systematic approach to murder was evidence of mental illness rather than criminal sophistication. The jury deliberated for 4 days before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. The extensive digital evidence, combined with the physical recovery of the victims' remains and Hoffman's detailed confessions, left little room for reasonable doubt about his guilt. However, The jury's lengthy deliberation reflected their struggle to understand how someone could use academic frameworks and online communities to justify and facilitate serial murder. During the penalty phase, victim impact statements from the families of Jennifer Morrison, Maria Santos, and Ashley Chen provided heartbreaking testimony about the devastating effects of Hoffman's crimes. Jennifer's mother described how her daughter's disappearance had destroyed their family's sense of security, leaving them unable to trust that their loved ones would return home safely each day. Maria's father spoke about the promising artistic career that had been cut short, and the community of artists who had lost not just a colleague but a source of inspiration and creativity. Ashley's sister delivered perhaps the most powerful statement, addressing directly how Hoffman's use of online communities had compounded the trauma of her loss. "He didn't just kill my sister," she told the court. "He turned her death into entertainment for strangers on the internet. He used her suffering to teach other people how to kill. Even after death, she couldn't rest because he kept exploiting her memory to feed his twisted research project." The judge sentenced Hoffman to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole on each murder count, with sentences to run consecutively. In delivering the sentence, Judge Patricia Williams addressed the unprecedented nature of the case and its implications for understanding criminal behavior in the digital age. "This case represents a new form of evil that our legal system is only beginning to understand," Judge Williams stated. The defendant used the Internet's vast resources and anonymous communities to transform murder from an impulsive crime into a systematic research project. He weaponized the legitimate interest that many people have in understanding criminal behavior, turning academic curiosity into a recruitment tool for violence. The sentencing also addressed the broader implications of Hoffman's network activities, with additional penalties for his role in influencing others to commit similar crimes. The judge noted that traditional concepts of individual criminal responsibility were inadequate for addressing crimes that used digital platforms for coordination and mutual reinforcement. David Park's prosecution in California resulted in convictions for 3 murders and multiple kidnapping charges, with evidence showing that his crimes had become increasingly sophisticated as he applied techniques learned from Hoffman's online mentoring. His case established important legal precedents about how online influence and recruitment could constitute criminal conspiracy across state lines. Rachel Kim accepted a plea agreement that resulted in convictions for stalking and conspiracy charges, avoiding murder charges by providing extensive cooperation with investigators tracking other members of the network. Her testimony revealed additional details about how Hoffman had used academic language and research frameworks to normalize discussions about violence and murder. The prosecution team worked with federal authorities to develop new legal frameworks for addressing crimes that spanned multiple jurisdictions and relied heavily on digital evidence. The Hoffman case became a model for how law enforcement agencies could coordinate investigations that involved online criminal networks, leading to new protocols for sharing digital evidence and conducting multi-state prosecutions. The conclusion of Marcus Hoffman's trial marked the beginning of a broader investigation into how online true crime communities might be harboring other individuals who were using academic interest as a cover for criminal planning. Detective Chen was appointed to lead a joint FBI local law enforcement task force dedicated to identifying and monitoring digital platforms where criminal methodology was being shared under the guise of educational content. The task force's analysis of the original forum where Hoffman had operated revealed disturbing patterns that extended far beyond his individual network. By using advanced data mining techniques to analyze posting patterns, language usage, and interaction networks, investigators identified dozens of other users whose behavior suggested they might be moving from theoretical interest in crime to practical application of criminal techniques. One particularly concerning discovery was a private messaging group that had splintered off from the main forum, where users shared increasingly explicit content about victim selection, abduction techniques, and evidence disposal. This group had been created after Hoffman's arrest, suggesting that his influence had continued even after he was removed from the platform. Members were using encrypted communication methods and more sophisticated operational security, having learned from Hoffman's mistakes about maintaining anonymity online. The investigation revealed that Hoffman's case was not an isolated incident but part of a broader phenomenon of criminal networking that was occurring across multiple platforms and communities. Similar patterns were identified in forums dedicated to weapons, explosives, and other dangerous topics, where legitimate educational interest was being exploited by individuals with criminal intentions. International cooperation became necessary as investigators discovered that Hoffman's techniques and philosophy had spread to users in other countries. Law enforcement agencies in Canada, the United Kingdom, and Australia reported cases that showed similar patterns of online research followed by real-world criminal activity. The digital nature of the criminal networking meant that geographic boundaries were meaningless, creating challenges for traditional law enforcement approaches that were organized around specific jurisdictions. The task force developed new investigative techniques for identifying potential criminals within legitimate online communities. These methods included behavioral analysis algorithms that could detect when users were transitioning from academic interest to practical planning, linguistic analysis that could identify individuals who possessed first-hand knowledge of criminal techniques, and network analysis that could map relationships between users who might be coordinating criminal activity. However, these investigative capabilities raised significant concerns about privacy rights and the potential for law enforcement overreach. Civil liberties advocates argued that monitoring online communities for potential criminal activity could lead to the criminalization of academic research and legitimate intellectual curiosity about violent crime. The challenge was developing methods that could identify genuine threats without suppressing legitimate educational and research activities. The true crime community itself began to grapple with the implications of Hoffman's case, with many forums implementing new moderation policies designed to prevent their platforms from being used for criminal purposes. Moderators were trained to recognize concerning posting patterns, and reporting mechanisms were established to alert authorities when users appeared to be sharing information based on personal criminal experience rather than research. Some platforms chose to restrict discussions of certain topics entirely, particularly those related to specific criminal techniques or methodologies that could be applied in real-world situations. However, this approach was controversial within the community, as many legitimate researchers and educators relied on these forums for academic discussions about criminal behavior and prevention strategies. Educational institutions also began reviewing their policies regarding student research into violent crime, implementing new oversight procedures for studies that involved detailed analysis of criminal methodology. The Rachel Kim case had demonstrated how academic research could potentially be used for criminal purposes, leading universities to establish ethics committees specifically focused on criminology and forensic psychology research. The media coverage of Hoffman's case sparked broader discussions about the responsibility of content creators in the true crime genre. Podcasters, authors, and documentary makers began questioning whether their detailed presentations of criminal techniques might inadvertently provide educational resources for potential criminals. Some creators chose to modify their content to focus more on victim stories and less on perpetrator methodology, while others implemented warning systems to discourage inappropriate use of their educational material. The investigation also revealed concerning trends in how criminal knowledge was being preserved and transmitted online. Archive sites and file-sharing platforms contained extensive collections of materials related to criminal methodology, including content that had been removed from mainstream platforms for violating terms of service. These archives were being used by individuals who wanted to access information about criminal techniques without leaving traces in their browsing history on legitimate educational sites. Mental health professionals began developing new screening procedures for identifying individuals who might be at risk of transitioning from academic interest in violence to actual criminal behavior. The psychological profiles from Hoffman's network provided valuable insights into the warning signs that might indicate when someone's fascination with crime was becoming dangerous, but implementing these screening procedures without stigmatizing legitimate academic interest remained a significant challenge. Follow-up investigations continue to uncover additional members of networks that had been influenced by Hoffman's online activity. Over the 2 years following his conviction, law enforcement agencies identified and arrested 11 individuals who had been directly or indirectly influenced by his forum posts to commit or plan violent crimes. These arrests occurred across 7 states and 2 countries, demonstrating the truly international scope of digital criminal networking. The ongoing investigation also revealed that Hoffman's influence had extended beyond direct criminal recruitment to shaping broader cultural attitudes about violence and victim selection. Analysis of online discussions showed that his systematic approach to murder had been adopted by individuals who weren't necessarily planning crimes themselves but were using his frameworks to analyze and discuss real criminal cases in ways that normalized violence against vulnerable populations. 3 years after Marcus Hoffman's conviction, Detective Chen published a comprehensive analysis of the case that would become required reading for law enforcement agencies worldwide. Her report, titled Digital Predation: Criminal Networking in Online Communities, detailed the investigative techniques that had been developed during the case and provided recommendations for preventing similar crimes in the future. The most significant lesson from the Hoffman case was the recognition that criminal behavior had evolved to exploit the connectivity and information resources of the digital age in ways that traditional law enforcement approaches were unprepared to address. Serial killing was no longer necessarily an isolated activity conducted by individuals working alone. It could become a collaborative research project that used online communities to share techniques, coordinate activities, and recruit new participants. Chen's analysis identified several key factors that had made Hoffman's network possible and successful. The anonymity provided by online platforms had allowed him to build relationships with potential accomplices without revealing his true identity or criminal history. The vast information resources available on the internet had provided him with research materials about criminal techniques that would have been difficult or impossible to access in previous generations. The social validation provided by online communities had reinforced his criminal activities and provided psychological support for continuing his crimes. Perhaps most importantly, the legitimate academic and educational framework surrounding criminal justice and forensic psychology had provided him with vocabulary and conceptual tools that made his criminal planning appear scholarly rather than threatening. By framing his discussions of murder techniques in academic language and presenting them as theoretical analysis of criminal behavior, he had been able to share detailed information about violent crime without triggering the alarm bells that more explicit criminal discussions might have raised. Training programs for law enforcement officers were updated to include education about online criminal networking and digital evidence analysis. Officers learned to recognize the signs of criminal recruitment and influence in online communities, and were taught techniques for conducting digital surveillance without violating privacy rights or compromising ongoing investigations. The traditional focus on physical evidence and witness testimony was supplemented with new skills in behavioral analysis and pattern recognition for online activity. Universities also implemented new reporting procedures for faculty members who noticed concerning changes in student behavior or research interests. The Rachel Kim case had demonstrated how academic research could potentially be used for criminal purposes, leading to increased vigilance about students who showed unhealthy levels of interest in violence or criminal techniques. However, these measures had to be balanced against academic freedom and the legitimate need for scholars to study criminal behavior in order to develop better prevention and intervention strategies. Technology companies faced increased pressure to develop better systems for detecting and preventing the use of their platforms for criminal purposes. The Hoffman case had demonstrated how mainstream social media platforms could be exploited for criminal recruitment and coordination, leading to calls for enhanced content moderation and user monitoring. However, implementing these systems without compromising user privacy or freedom of expression remained a significant technical and ethical challenge. The true crime entertainment industry also underwent significant changes in response to the case. Content creators began to consider more carefully how their detailed presentations of criminal techniques might be used by individuals with criminal intentions. Many podcasters and authors chose to focus more on victim stories and prevention strategies rather than providing detailed analyses of perpetrator methodology. Industry guidelines were developed to help creators balance educational value with the potential for misuse of their content. Mental health professionals developed new diagnostic criteria for identifying individuals who might be at risk of transitioning from academic interest in violence to actual criminal behavior. The psychological profiles from Hoffman's network provided valuable insights into the warning signs and risk factors that might indicate dangerous fascination with criminal activity. However, implementing screening procedures without stigmatizing legitimate academic research or criminology education remained an ongoing challenge. International law enforcement cooperation was enhanced through new agreements for sharing digital evidence and coordinating investigations that crossed national boundaries. The global nature of online criminal networking required unprecedented levels of cooperation between agencies that had traditionally operated independently within their specific jurisdictions. New protocols were established for extradition and prosecution of criminals whose activities spanned multiple countries. The long-term implications of the Hoffman case extended beyond criminal justice to broader questions about how society manages information and protects vulnerable populations in the digital age. The case demonstrated that the same technologies and platforms that provided tremendous benefits for education, communication, and community building could also be exploited by individuals with criminal intentions. 5 years after Hoffman's conviction, Detective Chen reflected on how the case had changed her understanding of criminal behavior and law enforcement. "We learned that we couldn't assume that criminals would continue to operate the way they had in the past," she noted. The digital age created new opportunities for criminal activity that required completely new approaches to investigation and prevention. The challenge for law enforcement was developing these new capabilities while still protecting the privacy and civil liberties that make democratic society possible. The victims' families continued to advocate for changes in how online platforms handled content related to violence and criminal activity. Jennifer Morrison's mother established a foundation dedicated to educating parents and educators about the warning signs of dangerous fascination with violent crime. Maria Santos's family worked with art schools to develop programs that would help identify students who might be vulnerable to criminal influence or recruitment. Ashley Chen's family lobbied for legislative changes that would make it easier for law enforcement to monitor and prosecute online criminal networks. The case ultimately demonstrated that protecting society from criminal activity in the digital age would require ongoing collaboration between law enforcement, technology companies, educational institutions, and communities themselves. The traditional boundaries between online and offline activity had dissolved, creating both new opportunities for criminal behavior and new tools for prevention and investigation. Success in addressing these challenges would depend on society's ability to adapt its institutions and approaches to the realities of an interconnected world where information, influence, and criminal activity could cross any boundary instantly and invisibly. As we reach the end of this investigation, we're left with profound questions about the world we've created through our digital connections. The case of Marcus Hoffman and his network reveals how the very technologies that bring us together can also be weaponized by those who seek to cause harm. The true crime community that we explored tonight began with the best of intentions, people sharing their interest in understanding criminal behavior, seeking justice for victims, and learning from the past to prevent future tragedies. But within that legitimate community, predators found ways to hide, to learn, to recruit, and to transform academic curiosity into deadly knowledge. We've seen how the line between observer and participant can be crossed gradually, almost imperceptibly, through careful manipulation and the normalization of violence. We've witnessed how online anonymity can provide cover for the most dangerous impulses, while the vast information resources of the digital age can accelerate the development of criminal expertise. The victims, Jennifer Morrison, Maria Santos, Ashley Chen, remind us that behind every case study, every forum post, every academic discussion, there are real people whose lives were cut short by someone who saw them not as human beings, but as subjects for experimentation. Their stories compel us to remain vigilant about how our fascination with crime can be exploited by those who create it. As you drift toward sleep tonight, consider the digital trails you leave behind, the communities you participate in, and the responsibility we all share for protecting the vulnerable from those who would exploit our shared interests for harmful purposes. In our interconnected world, we are all guardians of each other's safety, whether we realize it or not. Sleep peacefully, knowing that dedicated investigators like Detective Chen continue their work to identify and stop those who would use our digital connections to cause harm. And remember that justice, though sometimes delayed by the complexities of the modern world, ultimately finds its way to those who believe they can hide in the shadows of cyberspace. If you're still awake after that, subscribe, leave a like, and drop a comment. Which case should we cover next?